Hello there. So we've talked about Dante and Boccaccio, and finally we're on to Chaucer, the last of the proto-Renaissance figures who give us the last vestiges of medieval and Middle Age literature. And with Chaucer we finally return to England, which we haven't seen since just after the end of Alfred, when in came the Viking incursions and English literature was knocked back from the time of Alfred, when he had, using Boethius as a source, wanted to inject a flourishing English literary environment in the land. So that had faded with the incoming of the Vikings, and we saw through the Lindisfarne Gospel and other similar Gospels a slow fading out of the English literary tradition and in the context of its knowledge with the classics. But we've returned now with Chaucer, and he comes back to the fold through the influence of the proto-Renaissance Italian figures we just saw: Dante, Boccaccio, Petrarch. These influenced Chaucer, and he's able to re-energize English literature. England itself was also undergoing quite an important metamorphosis of its own accord, and a distinct turning in of the nobility into Englishmen as opposed to Normans or Frenchmen. And this is happening because during the 1300s, England is experiencing the 100 Years' War with France. And it's ironically that during its war with France, where Edward III is trying to claim his own stake as a king of France, that the nobility in England ended up becoming more English and less French than they had ever been before. And so it's during this time in which the nobility and the elites are becoming more distinctively English as opposed to French or Norse that Chaucer emerges to supplement that with an English literary tradition. If we think about France at this time, France was also, as the other half of the 100 Years' War, produced very, very little. We'd last been in France with the Romance of the Rose, and really bar the historian Froissart, whose chronicles follow the courts of the time, we have not a lot from France. So Chaucer is the figure between the two countries who stands out far more than a Froissart, for instance. And we also have the non-classical Provençal source from France, which has been put down because of the Albigensian heresy and the Crusades commissioned by Pope Innocent III. So that tradition is quelled in France, and England kind of bypasses France and looks straight to Italy for its sources. And when Chaucer does so, he's really starting his own great English tradition of looking towards Italy. We see it in Byron, we see it in Milton, it's there in Browning. This looking to Italy for inspiration and for fulfillment, so that you can pit yourself up against the best in the literary standard. That said, there is some influence from France in Chaucer. The Romance of the Rose was so popular a text that Chaucer could not but avoid being inspired by it, and he had a part translation of it. So there is a French connection there. But bar that, we go straight to Italy. And we go straight to Boccaccio. Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida, we know, is modelled on Boccaccio's Filostrato. And of course there's the own classical invocation of Troilus and Cressida, as we discussed earlier, that came out of the French Romance tradition. But really Chaucer's particular one comes from Boccaccio, Filostrato. The House of Fame by Chaucer, well, that's more his sort of attempt to stand up to Dante's Divine Comedy. The Knight's Tale in the Canterbury Tales of Chaucer, this has elements of Boccaccio's Theseid. And of course, more widely across the Canterbury Tales, we see a lot of inspiration coming straight from the Decameron, that idea of a group together telling tales, exchanging these certain tales and all these different perspectives and little kernels of wisdom contained within each tale. In the Decameron, it's a setting of young people retreating from the city during the time of the Black Death. But for Chaucer, it's, of course, the pilgrimage to Canterbury, hence the Canterbury Tales. And that idea of the procession, you can also say as well, is Chaucer's influence of certain, that idea of the Roman procession, perhaps like Petrarch's triumphs. And, of course, in the Clark's Tale, there's an actual taking of the story Passion and Griselda, which was a Boccaccio original. Though we think it came to Chaucer via Petrarch. He also was fond of stating how well he knew Dante. This is quoted in the Tale of the Wife of Bath. She quotes him, or rather Chaucer quotes Dante through her, as a means to show his literary knowledge and to show his Italian influence. He's not trying to hide it. He's actually quite proud of it. You have to remember at this point, to be such a Latinist and a scholar, and to be a part of, having been a part of the Italian scene, Chaucer wants to showcase this back into the more dark corners of England. And in the Wife of Bath's tale, she says, "Well can thy wise poet of Florence, that hight Dante, speaking in this sentence, low and switch manner. Rhyme is Dante's tale, full seed upriseth by his branches smell. Prowess of man, for God his goodness, while that of him we claim our gentleness." Now his classical knowledge is not without mistake. He often claims greater knowledge than he has. And again, this can be seen because he's taken these kernel of Italian ideas and showcasing it to England. He's showcasing it to an audience that doesn't really know much, but of course in our own age, we can go back and spot the errors. One of the most egregious is his inclusion of a character called Maximus Lollius, from whence this channel gets its name. Inclusion of him in the House of Fame. And the reason he has that is because in a letter by Horace is addressing Maximus Lollius, who's but just a mere student of him. But because of the Latin phrasing, Chaucer has mistakenly associated Maximus Lollius with the Trojan Wars, which is the context of the letter. So it goes, the writer of the Trojan War, Maximus Lollius, while you practice speaking in Rome, I reread at Praenest. You can see there Horace is addressing Maximus Lollius, but Chaucer thinks that he is talking of Maximus Lollius as the writer of the Trojan War. So even though he doesn't know anything about this text, he's going to pretend he does, and he's going to put Maximus Lollius into his House of Fame. And he would have gotten away with it too, and probably did in his own lifetime, but for the growth of classical knowledge, which caught him out later. Of classical sources that he did know quite well, I think Ovid, and there's certainly that Ovidian humour, which we touched upon in the Ovid in the Middle Ages video. Dryden also saw many similarities between the two poets, because you have to remember a lot of the reason why Chaucer is such a large name in English literature is because those immediate ones just after were the ones who really could associate with him. If you read the Middle English translation, direct translation of Chaucer, it sometimes can be quite dissociating. It can be quite long, and there's certain passages which maybe for the modern reader would not hold together. But for someone like Dryden, he's much closer to the time, and England has still a lot of middle-age characteristics which don't really cease to go out of it until the 19th century. So Dryden still sees that Chaucer effect. Shakespeare would have still seen that Chaucer effect. And so because he's so large in the minds of a Dryden or a Shakespeare, he's seen as really the source of the English literary scene. So if it weren't for the admiration that the likes of Dryden gave him, perhaps he would be further diminished in our esteem. But Dryden noticed that Chaucer had an eye for humour similar to that of Ovid. And we also know that Chaucer knew Ovid's, not just his Metamorphoses, but his lesser works, the Hedoids, and of course the art of love, cures for love are obvious inspirations when Chaucer is trying to juxtapose the two sexes together. He knew of Virgil's Aeneid, though found the hero's sense of duty, that piety in Aeneas, he found it somewhat stifling. You have to remember, he is a middle-aged writer, and it is Ovid and that Ovidian sense of humour as it developed through the Middle Ages, which are still in the environment holding the majority of the sway over Chaucer. Something like the piety contained within Aeneas is going to appeal more to a Dante, who is more closely associated with the church and more austere. Anyone who still wants to have that element of being a court poet or even a court entertainer more broadly is going to fall further back on Ovid than on Virgil. Nevertheless, underpinning a sense of jollity that comes through Ovid, there is that moral philosophy which comes straight from Boethius. And we see this in Chaucer's Ballad of Good Counsel, where he says, "Her is not whom, her is but wilderness. Forth, pilgrim, forth best out of thy stall, know thy country, look up, thank God of all." This sentiment is very similar to that which would have been experienced by Boethius in his containment, knowing thy country, his country being that of the fallen Roman country. More widely, about some classical figures that we haven't quite mentioned yet. We know Chaucer knew Statius and the late Latin poet Claudian. His rape of Proserpine was quite well known. Of Cicero, he knew the Dream of Scipio, probably because he was swimming in the same sort of literary circles that he would have seen that Petrarch was heavily inspired by that. And he based the Parliament of Files upon this Dream of Scipio. He mentioned Seneca, though likely only knew isolated passages, and all his Senecan quotes can come from the Tale of Melibus. In Chaucer's Tale of Melibus, all his Senecan quotes are taken from the Book of Consolation and Counsels by Albertano of Brescia. So it's more likely he got this book, which he knows contained tracts of Seneca, and that's where he got his Senecan snippets from, rather than being well read on Seneca. He mentions Valerius Flaccus, and also knows some of Boccaccio's genealogy of the gods, gives him good inspiration into the pagan mythology. Bovet's Mirror of History as well would have been a nice source of information for him. So we knew that Chaucer knew classics and he knew Europe. And for him, they were quite entwined. Even though Europe, for him, was really a courtly Europe. It was the courtly life of French and Italian romantic love poetry. Like Boccaccio, as we mentioned in the earlier one, he does become more devoutly a Christian with age. Boccaccio, of course, has the great baptism, but with Chaucer, it's more of a slow maturity that rises. No other character of the time, though, of Chaucer, could meld that English folktale method, see in the Canterbury Tales, with that classical continental style. And it needed a character, England needed a character like Chaucer to inject it back with the classical tradition. It was never going to be entirely smooth, and if you're reading the Canterbury Tales, it is quite a hefty one if you read the original language. But you have to understand that this is the re-injection into England of the classical tradition, which has been dormant since Alfred, so it's quite significant. And we know he wasn't alone, but he is the best craftsman of it. There's the Piers Plowman, other Piers Plowman poet, that was also around in a similar time. But the name has been lost to us, whereas the name of Chaucer, he is the first poet entombed in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. So he had something about him that others didn't. And it was probably simply the best knowledge and the best way to execute that knowledge. both from the Italian sources and then also knowing the knowledge of who his audience were and how the English courts, used to those old English folktales, would take these new stories coming from Italy.